And welcome everyone. We live. I think it's episode 5. It says on the slide deck of Get It, but it's out of sequence because we had a little bit of a hiccup the previous time that we needed to talk. My guest today is Suzanne Gilatley. She's the portfolio director of Exxon, an old friend, and it's great to have her with us today. Hello, Suzanne.
Hi, Johan. Thank you very much. It's great to be here today.
Okay, so today we're going to talk a little bit about education, and I suppose more job-related education, and how fast things are changing around us, and what one needs to do to innovate in that space. So let's kick off by asking this question. How do you keep pace with all the changes that's busy happening in the world if you're an education provider or certification body? How do you make sure that what is on offer is what is needed?
Well, there's a lot of elements, I think, to that question, Johan, because as you sort of hint at in the question, there's so many developments going on at the moment. In terms of how we keep pace, I'm sure we'll be looking at those developments specifically as we move forward. But in terms of the way that we do that, we make sure that when we're looking at new products to develop and the like, that we make sure that we consult with the market, because obviously we know how to develop great exams, but the market knows what it needs, how society and business is changing, what does that mean for the specific skills and knowledge areas that people need. So we always do a lot of consultation and research that feeds into defining those skills needs. And of course, there's so many developments going on. I mean, just to name a couple, we see that people want a lot more flexibility these days in the way that they are learning. And obviously that gives rise to so many different developments like bite-sized learning, micro-credentials. And I think the other massive development is, of course, the fact that online ways of learning have also taken over a bit. I think there's still a place, a valuable place for classical training, but online and digital ways of learning are becoming obviously much more popular. And I think COVID accelerated that whole process. And then you also see, platforms coming in. So there's certainly a lot going on in the world of learning, let's say. It's a very dynamic time.
Yeah, and all of that complexity, I suppose, also makes it very difficult for people to choose what they learn, because there's so many channels and avenues available for them to learn things. But I suppose one of the questions that one should ask yourself is whether it's good learning. So clearly, if it's something from a large institution, you can judge it by the reputation of the large institution, and I think similarly in your case, with a respected exam institute, you at least know that there was some forethought that went into this process of developing something. Okay, so how do one? I suppose the conversation can be held from two perspectives. How do one innovate in the education space as an education provider or as an exam institute? And how do one innovate personal learning from a recipient or a candidate perspective? Go for any which one you want to go first.
Well, I think from the perspective of an education provider, obviously we need to make sure that we are seeing those trends and that we are processing those trends and able to do something with those trends. So, we see so many trends. I mean, there's also, I've not even mentioned AI yet. We could probably do a 10 podcasts only on AI alone, but obviously that has a big impact as well. But I think from an education provider perspective, just to put that one first, because I think it's better to end with the learner side, because in some ways that's more important. But from the provider side, yeah, we are looking at all kinds of different trends, like lifelong learning, like micro-credentialing, like the use of technology, like making sure that assessments are done in an exciting way. I mean, there's a lot of things going on around gaming and simulation. So there's all those interesting developments, and we have to make sure that we are staying on top of those. At the same time, we see also that the certification market itself is in some ways fairly conservative and fairly slow to move, even though the world around us is moving at a massive pace. So we have to get that balance between innovating and making sure that we're staying on top of those things and not changing everything too quickly that the market thinks, oh, what is this, and can I trust it? And obviously trust is, I think, something that you've touched on as well, because there is in this new world, there are so many providers of learning. Some of them are very trusted and very good, but sometimes I think as a learner it's probably difficult to pick out the really good institutions from the ones that are not. So it means you have to do your research pretty well, into which ones are actually have a good reputation and are solid, whilst at the same time, of course, expecting new things from an education provider in terms of how assessments are done and how technology is being made use of, if you like. In the education sector, just like any other, if we don't find a way to adapt to those technologies, we'll get left behind. And that's why you see this move towards, online ways of working. We offer our exams, for instance, you can do them anytime, anywhere via an online platform. We've had that for several years, but I think COVID accelerated that a lot. And we saw that, a lot of learning models also amongst our training providers moved from classical training situations and perhaps doing an exam straight afterwards in a classroom to studying online, sometimes in a bite-sized way, picking 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there in between your day job, and then doing an exam whenever suits you, wherever suits you. So we saw COVID accelerating that, and it's important for us to stay on top of it. Yeah.
It's interesting that you said that the market is pretty conservative. And I'm reading between the line, that's not the consumer. That's the providers that works with you. Is that a correct assumption?
Good point.
Okay.
Good
if
point.
You don't want to comment, that's also okay.
Thorny question.
Yeah.
It's the channels, of course, for we recognize that some of the same challenges that we are facing, our partners are also facing, because they're also having to reinvent themselves. They had to reinvent themselves during COVID, and they have to reinvent themselves to adapt to the expectations of the learner regarding, how interactive something is, how flexible it is to fit into their lives. So we recognize that our partners are faced with a lot of the same challenges that we are, and that takes time for them to adapt to that as well. We also see a lot of differences in regions. So, and I think that might partly be a cultural, just cultural differences. Some regions, for instance, were very, very quick to adapt to online during the COVID crisis and haven't really looked back. So haven't really gone back to, for example, classical training, whereas some other markets, regional markets, were sort of slower to react, to get things online and get things to be made available in a different way, and have been also partly, at least, going back to how it was, as opposed to making that a permanent change. So yeah, that's the joys and complexities of a global organization. We see a lot of differences which are interesting in how forward-thinking markets are, both in the way they think about learning and also in the way that they adapt to new technologies and how quickly they can make that adaptation.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I mean, some of the, if you want to do sort of traditional classroom-based learning, which incidentally is still my preference. As a trainer, I'd love to be in front of a group of people and actually be able to interact with them. But the reality is that our customers don't want that anymore. And especially, you touched on it a little bit earlier, this issue of micro-learning and micro-credentialing. Yeah, and you can't do that if you don't sort of open up to different ways of sharing your content with your learner. So
Yeah.
tell us a little bit about that trend and what do you think that means for training providers and for consumers of training?
Yeah. So first of all, don't get me wrong, I'm absolutely not dissing classical training. I think it still has a valuable place, particularly for very practical courses, because there's so much that can be gained from peer-to-peer interaction. Of course, sometimes peer-to-peer can happen in a blended learning situation as well, online, but then with peer-to-peer. So there's so many different models out there, and I think that's maybe one of the things that we see, Johan, also with micro-credentials, for instance. Micro-credentials means something completely different to one person than it does to another. And if you talk to a university, for them, a micro-credential will be similar in line to maybe an essentials or even a foundation course, because their courses in general are months or even years long. So for them, a micro-credential is a piece of learning that's, probably several days long, leading to a certification. And then you're looking at foundation or even advanced level certifications from the professional certification space perspective. Whereas if you talk to other areas of the organization, of society and business, a micro-credential might be something that they expect to be given after 2 or 3 hours of learning. So yeah, it can be, it's one of those things that's still in development. So there are very different perspectives on what it's about. I think the important thing is that, micro credentials support a new way of learning. And that new way of learning is where we give flexibility and control, if you like, to the learner about how and where and when they absorb their learning. And, quite often, I think that's partly to do with the sort of technology and online development, but it's also partly, socio-cultural. The young people of today don't expect to, do a 5-day training in a room. They expect to be able to, they're getting information everywhere from the internet and snippets, and they're doing 10 minutes here and 10 minutes there. And their whole way of learning is different than how that traditionally used to be. So their expectations are different. And I think that's what's, it's not just about sort of, let's say, exploiting new technology anymore. It's also about what does the learner expect and how can I, as an education provider, respond to that expectation? And that's more, I would say, societal, cultural developments that come in, because people expect to be able to do it anytime, anywhere, in little snippets, how they want to do it, ideally interactively. They expect something there. Things need to be a bit exciting to keep their attention. So that's quite a lot of asks from a marketplace that's in transition, because we all know that transition is difficult, and can take time. So it's trying to respond to those developments.
Okay, I just thought about that. Yeah, if we say, and incidentally, I agree with the 3-hour definition of micro credentials. Otherwise, for me, that's not micro. But I've never thought of it. I mean, the traditional model is to sit a 1 or 2 hour exam once you've learned something. And if you've only spent 3 hours learning something, clearly that model of assessment becomes a challenge. So what are some of the ideas that you guys are playing with in terms of alternative ways of doing assessment, what people has learned on the fly?
Yeah, I mean, there's different, innovative ways of looking at that. You could, for instance, think of, we see a lot of movement around serious gaming and simulations, and obviously technologies like VR and AR come into that as well. As those technologies become more commonplace, at the moment they're still sometimes in a fairly early phase, and therefore also sometimes prohibitively expensive. But as those technologies become more general purpose, and also then therefore less costly, you could imagine that assessment that's more around simulation or serious gaming, making use of VR or AR, I think is definitely a reality. Is it doable today? There's one side to that is the cost side, and the other side to that is the market acceptation side. And I think that's in development. I think in some areas of the market, at least, there's still this kind of feeling, and again, sometimes there's differences regional in this. But we're very strong in some Asian markets, for instance, and in Asia, the whole ceremony around an exam and doing an exam in a formal manner is important to the value of that certification. Now, that might be very different in another market, but if you would try to introduce a kind of, trendy interactive game in those markets at the moment, even though a lot of those markets are very technology savvy, they have culturally, they appreciate the formality around an exam and associate that with the value of it. So
it's sort of a ritual.
A ritual, it is, and I think those rituals will change, and I think that VR, AR will be part of that solution. But the timing and how you do that and how you get that balance is definitely something at the moment that is in process, let's say, or in progress. Yeah,
I'm giving my age away, but in the early 90s, I used to be a CME. For some people will still remember what that was. That was one of the first technology certifications and the hottest in the market. But I mean, in the early 90s, already our exams included simulation. So you would get a question, and then you need to go and do something with a admin console or whatever. And it's strange that, and it's not high tech. It's strange that that's not used more.
Yeah, it is actually. If you look at the professional certification, the way that professional certifications are done for the most part by most providers is similar to it hasn't changed for quite a lot of years. And let's be honest, change happens when there's a sense of urgency and when the consumer is demanding it. So it's probably been easy to be complacent for a while, but it isn't anymore, because learner expectations are changing, and it's important to then adapt with that. So that's an interesting that is an interesting observation, and I think it might be partly also to do with this business that we're in of professional certification, or Exin is in, is of course a trust business. You have to be able to trust that those competencies are being tested, in a good way. Otherwise, the value of the certification deteriorates. So, I think it's also partly to do with the nature of professional certification, that you expect the quality and the security around the process. You expect the integrity of the process to be high, and that's important for the value of the certification. But I do think it will, and is already starting to change to more interactive ways of assessing, and also to the link with learning. Certainly, the way that people learn needs to be more interactive and more flexible. So, certification is obviously very linked to that path as well.
And do you think that the shift in the market is generational, or is it driven by technology?
I think a bit of both, Johan. I mean, there's certainly things about the generation of today, sort of, let's say, from a generational cultural perspective, that are different. They expect, for instance, a lot of people, they expect to they don't just want to earn money, they want to change the world, which I think is great. And let's be honest, there's quite a few challenges for them to get their teeth into these days. So there's expectations of having a broader purpose in life. There's expectations around having a better work-life balance. You know, that's changed massively generationally. But I also think the impact of technology is considerable. And I especially think if you look at AI, which is sort of starting on that path towards becoming a general purpose technology, you know, that is going to have a massive impact on the workforce. And I think it's a bit different than perhaps we thought. You know, 10 years ago, there was a lot of scaremongering around, you know, all the jobs will disappear because of AI, they'll all be taken over. I think that, you know, the World Economic Forum actually suspects that by 2030, only 5% of jobs will actually be eliminated. Okay. But about 50% of them will be changed. And that's massive. So that means that half of people working, you know, today, their jobs will be changed in some way in the coming time by AI, digitization, automation. So yeah, we see certain jobs disappearing, certain jobs coming on. The net balance is supposed to be more jobs coming on than disappearing, but of course they are different types of jobs, and that also has a societal impact, because if you think about the jobs that will disappear, a lot of them will be routine admin jobs that can be automated very easily, and also potentially middle management jobs as well, because AI enables frontline entry-level people. Yeah, it all becomes more data-driven, less supervision is required for middle management level. So I think they're the jobs, middle management and routine admin, are likely to disappear. Whereas if you think about the jobs that will be created, a lot of them are very specialized, you know, around technology skills, but also business development skills, analytical thinking, a lot of jobs around data analyst and data scientist, and being able to handle the technology, exploit the possibilities of the technology, and they're very highly specialized jobs. So I think that even though more jobs will be created, they're not necessarily the same type of jobs, and that will have an impact on society.
Yeah, it reminds me of a quote from something that Alvin Toffler said. He said that the illiterate of the 21st century would not be those who cannot learn, but those who can't learn and unlearn and relearn at a rapid pace. Which, for somebody that suffers from attention deficit, that's awesome. I love it. But I can see there's a bunch of people it's going to really suffer greatly with all of these new trends. Okay, so anything else on the technology front that you think will have a significant impact, except for AI, on learning in the next, let's say, 5 or so years?
I think that you know, I've touched on VR and AR, and you know, that sort of links into the metaverse and all of those kinds of developments. So I think that's a development that is important and will perhaps change the way that we interact. There was recently a new pair of glasses brought out, wasn't there? That was I think it was from Google, wasn't it, with the VR and AR reality that you put on the glasses. I think that we don't know what direction it's moving in yet, but we can see that's definitely going to be a more commonplace technology as we move forward. Exactly how that pans out, I think, is still in the balance. So you've got VR and AR on the one side. I think you know, technologies that, because we've got so many risks in this digital era, I think technologies that help to mitigate those risks will also become important, like blockchain. Blockchain was, you know, long considered to be basically about cryptocurrency, but the applications, and I mean applications in the sense of the way you can apply blockchain, is very much broader than the cryptocurrency space. You know, you're talking about smart contracts, you're talking about traceability, auditability, and in a trust. Blockchain can buy you trust, and in an era where we're quite low on trust and there's a lot of deep fake stuff and all of these things, that can be very important. So I think they're really important. I do think AI is the big game changer though, and I think that AI, I think that what we'll see happening in the coming years in AI is that the legal and ethical side is playing a massive catch-up game. You know, the first sort of legislation around AI has been agreed, at least on a high level, the AI Act from the European Union, but it's such a big catch-up game. Also, the ethical side, you know, UNESCO has got some ethical guidelines that were accepted by all the member states. It's a milestone, but ethical guidelines are exactly that. They're guidelines. There's very little legislation, and you see that leads to all kinds of you know, we heard about some of the big tech giants coming out and saying what we've created could end up being a big monster that we can't control anymore. Great. Well, thanks for thinking of that now that it's out there and we're playing catch up. You know, there's no stopping it. So the legislation and the ethical side has to try and catch up to make sure that there's some regulation. But I do think, you know, it's as there's those sides of it which are a threat, but I also think there's a massive opportunity with AI of how machine and human can work together. And luckily I'm one of the people that still very much thinks that there are very human skills that are still unique to humans. In 50 years, who knows, maybe AI has mastered them so much that they're not unique to us anymore. But at the moment, certainly, there are still skills that are very unique to us humans. And the opportunity is in working together, human and machine, and not in replacing it.
Okay. So, yeah, David, so just remember, it's not me, it's Alvin Toffler, and the book was called Future Shift. So, but I'm glad if there is something that you've learned from us. Okay. We said that we're going to shift back to the consumer perspective, and we've got 2 minutes left.
Oh, I think most of it's been about the consumer in the end, the learner, the learner.
Yeah. So, is there anything that you would like to add from a learner or a consumer perspective?
So, specific, I feel like actually most of it has been from the learner and consumer perspective, because I feel like the learner is driving all of this. It's the learner that's telling us, you know, we need to well, it's the learner that's telling us we want more flexibility, we want things delivered in a different way. It's the learner that's telling us we want online, we want more interactive, we want things in a different way. So I think in the end it's all led by the learner. But I think that also the impact of, you know, the changes that we've talked about in society and business, and the impact of that on changing skill needs within organizations is also, of course, important in that, because, you know, you said it yourself, learn, unlearn and relearn. I think if you look at it from a learner perspective, there are different skills that you can say, you know, in this digital era, you need to develop certain types of skills. And I think that because machines can do certain kinds of things, I think that what we as humans can add is more the human skills that are unique to humans. Things like applying good judgment. That's still something that's very much a human skill, because you have to understand nuances. Leadership, and also empathy, of course. Empathy is perhaps the number one, because nobody else can understand what it's like to be another human apart from another human. So you've still got very much those skills. But I actually think that, and maybe this is already moving to, you know, the takeaway. You mentioned it yourself with learn and unlearn and relearn. I think at the end of the day, probably the most important thing, if you're wanting to thrive in this new age and this new digital world, is not even really a skill, but more of a mindset, because you need to have that lifelong learning mindset. because what you learned yesterday is important, but you'll have to learn something else tomorrow. And I think we'll see in moving forward, I think we'll see that the people that thrive are the people that are curious, the people that, you know, want to keep learning, keep developing themselves, keep adapting. And those people who have that natural curiosity and wish to keep learning and improving themselves, they're the ones that will really thrive, because it doesn't matter then where you've come from. It's about having that curiosity to adapt and see the opportunities in the digital world of how we can work together with machines, and learning whatever's necessary to do that. I don't necessarily mean massive heavy tech skills, but also those other things like judgment, like analytical, you know, judgment, leadership, empathy, creativity, those things that humans are good at. If people are curious to learn those and to keep learning them, you know, not just to think, okay, I'm done now with my learning, but to keep learning and have that mindset, they will thrive in this era.
Okay, so let's summarize. 5 things that I can do to be a good lifelong learner.
Gosh, that's putting me on the spot, Johan. Well, I think I can. I think I can answer it though. I think there's a few things. One is realize that you have to become a serial master. What do I mean by a serial master? I mean that you know, it used to be enough to learn one thing and then that would stand you in good stead in your career. It's not anymore. You have to become a master, and then probably 2 or 3 years later, maybe even earlier, you'll become a master in the next thing. So serial mastery is one thing. One thing is network is very important in lifelong learning. Build your own personal profile, your own network around you, and invest in that. Own your own development journey. Don't expect other people to come knocking on your door and saying, oh, do you want to learn something, or do you want to do some training, or do you want to you know, do a certification, or whatever that it is. Own your own journey and decide what that should look like.
It's not the company's responsibility, it's yours.
Exactly. And I think that's 3 already. I'll end with 1, but I think then I've got 4 and not 5. Is that acceptable?
Okay, that's fine.
So the 4th is to do what you love and discover your ikigai. Maybe some of you know the word. It's a Japanese word. Yeah. Your reason for being. Because if you know what gives you passion, if you know what, you know, makes you tick, and you are doing what you love doing, then learning will never be a chore. It will just be a pleasure.
Yeah, awesome. Love it. Thank you very much. It was an awesome conversation. Stay online. I just need to go through a few formalities. So I assume that I can share some contact detail because I got it off LinkedIn.
Certainly.
So that
Thanks,
means
Johan,
it is in the public domain. You can't blame me for that.
No
so
problem
if
at
any
all.
of you want to have a conversation with Suzanne about some of the things that we've talked about, please do contact her. Send her an invite on LinkedIn or send her a mail. Or if you want to phone, just phone the Exxon number in Utrecht. So reach out. Secondly, I'm really bad at marketing myself, and I've decided I need to start doing this now. So if you want to watch this episode again, or any other episode in the past, so I think there's about 60 of them now, spreading over just over 3 years, please go to YouTube, to my YouTube channel, select podcast, like, subscribe, ring the bell. I see that's what everybody else is telling people to do. And that just leaves me to say thank you very much. See you next time. And I hope you have lots of fun until we talk again.
Thank you very much, Johan.